Test, test. Can everybody hear me? Wow. Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to be here today and to be talking to you in real life and not as little Zoom squares on my screen. Although I probably miss some of your dogs and cats walking in and out of frame. That's pretty fun. We have a lot of great talks that are going to be given over the next couple days. And I'm so honored to be in front of you here today giving my talk. I just want to take a moment as well to just be grateful to everyone who supported me and given me this opportunity to be talking in front of you here today. All right, so let's just get to it. The topic of this talk is going to be Shopify dev tools to support you in how to improve your app building process. So this is going to be a pretty high-level talk. So for those of you who don't have experience building apps, this is great because it's going to give you an overview on the tools that we have to support you through your app building journey. And for those of you who are veterans, don't fall asleep yet. We're going to give you a sneak peek on what's coming up next, as well as the newest features that we've come out with in our recent June editions. So a little bit of something for everybody, and hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of what tools we have available. Before I begin, I'd just like to give you a little introduction to myself, because I'll be talking to you for the next 20, 30 minutes, so only fair that we have a little bit of an introduction. My name is Jamie. I am a senior developer on the app configuration team. That's the team that owns a lot of the app section on the partner's dashboard. We were previously called the App Developer Experience team as well, so we really care about the app developer experience. If you have any feedback, I'd love to chat with any of you folks over the next couple days. And just feel free to follow me on Twitter and say hey. And I also hang out in Discord and the Shopify Slack as well. So don't be a stranger. So what can you folks expect to get out of this talk? First, we're going to go over the development process. What is that? What are the tools that we have at Shopify to help support you in each of these steps? Next, we're going to dive into each one of these tools in the development process and talk about what they are, as well as what the newest releases that we have come out with. And then after that, we're going to go through a sneak peek of what's coming up next on the roadmap, which I know a lot of you are probably really excited for. Lastly, we're going to have a Q&A session. So there'll be a lot of topics. If you have any questions about any of the tools that I'm talking about here today, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. And if you're a little shy, again, feel free to say hi on Twitter or on Discord or Slack. So before we get too deep into the talk, let's actually talk about why we're doing this. Why does Shopify care so much about the app developer experience? It's a mouthful. Well, first of all, Shopify can't cover every use case for every single merchant out there with our ever-changing, globalizing, moving, evolving e-commerce landscape. That's why we rely on third-party developers such as yourselves to cover these use cases that we can't always cover and see by building apps and extensions. It's really important to cover these critical merchant functionalities. In turn, Shopify works to become increasingly extensible as a platform. That means developing new developer tools, coming out with new documentation to help you use these tools, as well as taking out the guesswork of building these apps and designing them by providing app design guidelines. So you guys can build the best e-commerce apps out there. As I mentioned before, we're going to go through the development process. That's a 3-step process of design, develop, and deploy. We know in reality that this 3-step process isn't exactly linear. You might move between 2 of the steps multiple times, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to go through them one by one. I'll be speaking fairly quickly on this slide, so don't feel like you need to gather all the information about every tool right on this slide, because we'll be diving into all of them individually. But just to get a understanding, as well, please note that some of these tools do appear in multiple steps, such as Polaris, which is both a design system and a component library, and the Shopify CLI, which has multiple purposes to automate common development tasks. Diving into the first step, we have Polaris. Polaris is a design system that we have at Shopify that we have built for internal use to build interfaces such as the Shopify admin. We have open sourced this design system so that you folks can use it to build your apps and make them more seamless in integrating their look and feel into the admin. Another tool we'll be talking about in the design step are the app design guidelines, which we've actually just released at our most recent June editions, which are a set of guidelines and rules that help you understand what good UI and UX is at Shopify. Moving on to the next step, we have the develop step. The first tool we'll be talking about in this step, again, is Shopify's CLI 3.0. We have recently released this new version of the CLI at our recent June editions. It is a command line tool for you to automate common development tasks. The next tool we'll be talking about is AppBridge. AppBridge is a component library, if you're not familiar with it. It's a component library that helps you embed your app into the Shopify admin. We're also going to talk about the API libraries that we have available for you to handle Shopify-related concerns. And lastly, we have our good friend Polaris showing up again as a React component library. The last step in the development process that we'll be talking about today is the deploy step. And we see the Shopify CLI 3.0 tool in there again because we are using that tool to automate a lot of common development tasks. That includes deploying your app as well. Okay, so let's just dive into the first step in the development process, the design step. At Shopify, we know that building apps is hard work. How do you get from an app idea, burning a hole in your pocket, to actually designing the app and then scaffolding it out? So what we've done is we've heard community feedback from developers that you're trying to piece together what is good UI and UX. So what we've done at our most recent editions is release the app design guidelines, which tell you what we consider great apps to look, feel, and perform like. We're telling you here what is acceptable and what is not, all the way down to color and navigation. There's actually a talk later on today around 2 o'clock about app design guidelines if you folks want to know specifics. And the goal of these app design guidelines is mainly to remove any guesswork from designing your app. They're there to help you focus more on coding your app rather than what it should look like. And they also make for great, if you follow these guidelines, it also makes for a great user experience. In fact, we think that if you follow these app design guidelines, it'll lead to higher ratings, higher reviews, and therefore upgrade your standing in the App Store. So it's a win-win-win for everybody because the merchants get a great user experience. You have to think less about less about designing your app and more about building your app, which I know you developers love to do. And then you possibly could get a higher standing in the App Store if you follow these app design guidelines. The next tool we'll be talking about in the design process is Polaris. As I mentioned before, Polaris is a design system that we built at Shopify to build our internal interfaces. Before I dive too far into it, I'd like to dispel any misconceptions with the app design guidelines and Polaris. The app design guidelines are there as more than just visual standards. They also contain content, voice, onboarding guides. We just believe that if you use Polaris to build your app, that it's the easiest route because they are already compliant with these guidelines. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out, everything is out of the box, and you're already on board with the app design guidelines. As I mentioned, it's an open source design system that we've updated recently in our documentation to make it easier to filter and find the components that you're looking for. In each of the components that we have in our documentation, we also include a little link to Figma so that you can build your app really easily by downloading these assets and creating a prototype and getting an idea of what your app is going to look like and feel like exactly. You can build the prototype and then translate it into code using our component library. Speaking of code, let's move on to the next step in the development process, the develop step. The first tool we'll be talking about is the Shopify CLI 3.0. We just recently released released version 3 in June editions, and we completely rehauled the CLI with simplicity in mind. The first update I'd like to talk about is the fact that you can actually, Shopify CLI is not installed as a global package. It is actually a dependency of your app. This means that you can install whatever version of the CLI you would like, and now you can upgrade whenever you choose. Another update that we've made to the CLI are our new starter templates that we have available in JavaScript, PHP, and Ruby. If you take a look at the app.jsx file, and after you scaffold your app, you'll notice that we have starter code for Polaris and AppBridge all ready to go. Those libraries are already installed for you to use once you scaffold out your app. You also have helper and middleware folders, which are full of starter code that helps you authenticate to the admin API using OAuth and using the Shopify API library. We also have available storage adapters for any database of your choice. Again, the theme here is simplicity, and we've tried to make it as fast as possible for you to go from app idea to designing your app to scaffolding your app as fast as possible. Another update to the Shopify CLI is this new yarn generate extensions command. For those of you who want to use Shopify extensions, now it's easier than ever just to run yarn generate extensions. You can select which extension you want to generate using your arrow keys in the terminal, and it's that dead simple. It'll generate that starter code and plop it into your root folder in your app. The last update that I'll talk about today about the Shopify CLI is our improvements to local development. We've heard from developer feedback that the tunneling experience for using that the tunneling experience is somewhat unreliable and flaky. So we have made improvements to the dev command to make it easier for you to stay on localhost for longer. You still have to use a tunnel to test webhooks or check out extensions, but we are continually improving this process. Now you can run yarn dev in your root folder and serve both your app and extension at the same time. Moving on from the last tool, we're talking now about the API libraries, which are also available in Ruby, JavaScript, and PHP, or as I like to call them, the starter Pokemon, Charmander, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle. Thank you for the pity laugh. That's what I miss the most about in-person presentations. I love the Pokemon Pop-It, very cool. All right. So again, the API libraries are there to handle Shopify-related concerns. That means creating a token to authenticate to the admin API using OAuth, handling webhook validations, as well as making calls to our REST and GraphQL APIs, or endpoints. Your app is pre-configured with the Shopify API library in your language of choice when you start up with that starter template. Shopify wants to continuously improve, so if you have any feedback that you'd like to give on any of the API libraries that we were talking about today, or any of these starter templates that you're using, feel free to go into the respective GitHub repos and open an issue, because there are devs just like me in there every day looking to talk to developers like you. The next tool that we're talking about in the develop step is AppBridge. AppBridge is a component library that helps you embed your app into the Shopify admin. Two new updates to AppBridge that Farhan actually touched on a little bit earlier were two features that were much requested and long awaited. The first one being pinning your app to the left side navigation. We've heard feedback from merchants that it is somewhat tedious to install an app and then have to search for it and then find it and then use it. So we made it possible for you now to pin your app to the left side navigation. Very important real estate there. Speaking about real estate, the second new feature that we're releasing with AppBridge is full screen mode. We've heard that merchants need more screen real estate to perform focused tasks. So we've made it possible for you now to take over the whole viewport and provide merchants with a better user experience that way. The last update to AppBridge that I'm mentioning today is optimized loading for mobile. This is an opt-in process, and everything has been done on the Shopify end of things. So you simply have to log in to your partner's dashboard and just turn on optimized loading for your app, either on test stores or in production stores separately. And what this does is if you open up your app on mobile and you're using AppBridge components, you'll notice a more native look and feel to these AppBridge components, as well as improved loading times. We found that people who have opted into this optimized loading for mobile are finding anywhere between 2 to 10 times loading speed improvements. It's a lot. Okay, and last but not least, the last tool we're talking about in the development step is Polaris. In the context of the development step, Polaris is a React component library, and we've updated, again, our documentation on our site to show a code snippet for each of the components and each of the variants that we show on our documentation with example props. So it's easy for you to just copy snippets of code and literally build the app that you prototyped. We've also released a VS Code extension called Polaris for VS Code, which allows for autocomplete for tokens, previewing your colors, and also just code completion for snippets as well. All right, and let's move on to the last step in the development process, the deploy step. In this step, we have the Shopify CLI showing up again. It is a command line tool, right, to help you handle common development tasks. So that meant scaffolding out your app, generating extensions, as well as now deploying your app. If you're familiar with CLI version 2, you might be familiar with this set of code snippets where to serve your app and to deploy your app, you need to traverse up and down the file tree, serving your app and your extension separately. Now we've made it easier for you to yarn dev to serve and yarn deploy to just serve your app and extension together. Another update to make it easier for you folks to deploy are our updates to the documentation on shopify.dev. We now have full instructions and tutorials on how to deploy your app using Fly and Heroku. On the screen, you can see an example of how to deploy your app using fly.io, but take a look at our documentation site to learn more. For those of you who have more complicated deployments using token-based authentication, we also support you, and we have updated our documentation so that you can see examples of how to deploy your app using Circle CI or GitHub Actions. All right, we made it through all the tools you need to build your app today. Let's do a quick review on how they all fit into the design or to the development process. First, we have the design guidelines, which are a set of guidelines and rules that explain what Shopify considers to be good UI and UX. Then we have Polaris, which is both a design system as well as a React component library to help you go from designing your app to building your app as fast as possible. We have API libraries that are there to help you handle Shopify-related concerns in your development step, as well as AppBridge, which helps you embed your app into the Shopify admin. And last but not least, we have the Shopify CLI, which helps you scaffold out your app, generate extensions, and deploy your app. Now I think this is the part of the presentation that all you veterans are really excited for to see what is upcoming next and a sneak peek on the Shopify roadmap. If you noticed in the presentation, we invested a lot and we talked a lot about the design and the deploy and the design and the develop steps. So I think it only makes sense for Shopify now to turn its attention and invest more into the deploy step. Here are 3 new upcoming features on our roadmap. The first one being defining performance standards. You can think of these as sort of app design guidelines, but for performance. After you've designed and developed your app, how can you make it more scalable? A designer on this project also told me that you can consider it something like Web Vitals or Lighthouse, but for Shopify apps. So really exciting stuff. The next item on our roadmap is tunneling via Cloudflare. I touched on this really briefly during the Shopify CLI section and our updates to local development. Another thing that we're trying to do to help improve local development is giving you more options for tunneling. That means including Cloudflare. And the last update on the roadmap that I'm personally most excited for is creating development packages. This means allowing you to develop and deploy your app as a bundled package. Some cool use cases for this are to maybe do A/B testing. So having one version A on one test store and another version B of your app on another test store. It'll also make rollback much easier having bundled versions as well as version deployments. I hope you folks can see that Shopify is committed to improving the developer experience for you, and maybe even you can see now where these tools fit into your app building experience or your normal flow. Before I leave you, I'd like to leave you with a couple questions that I'd love you to mull over and answer either now in the Q&A period or later on just to chat. Out of the tools or releases that we talked about today, which ones can you bring in and use internally? Out of all the sneak peeks that you've seen today, which one are you most excited for? And what has your experience been if you've already used some of these tools? That was 3 questions, so I'll give some time back to you guys for those questions that you have. All right, and that was the talk. Don't be a stranger. Please join our Discord. Yep, take pictures, please. And follow our channel Developer Experience to give feedback on any of the tools we talked about today. Give us a follow on Shopify Devs on Twitter to get all the newest updates, announces, and releases. And again, that's my Twitter handle if you want to say hey. Lastly, feedback. We consider feedback at Shopify to be a gift. This QR code is specifically for this talk. So if you have any feedback for how I did or any of the tools and you want to give it back, that'll really help Unite, as it'll help us create more content for future iterations of this talk. It's only a 3-question survey, so it'll literally take 2 minutes. And I was told that I get a prize if I get the most feedback. Oh, I feel bad. That was a lie, so I got a laugh for it, but thank you. All right, and with